Transubstantiations of Marxism. In modern history, the politics of revolutionary terror casts its shadow over the epoch which spans from Robespierre to Mao, or, more generally, the disintegration of the Communist bloc in 1990. Its last installment was the Maoist Cultural Revolution. Obviously, the socio-historical context had changed radically between the French Revolution and the Cultural Revolution. To put it in Platonist terms, what unites the two is precisely and only the same eternal idea of revolutionary justice. In the case of Mao, the question is even whether one can legitimately count him as a Marxist, since the social base of the Maoist revolution was not the working class. One of the most devious traps which lurk for Marxist theorists is the search for the moment of the fall, when things took the wrong turning in the history of Marxism. Was it already the late Engels, with his more positivist evolutionary understanding of historical materialism? Was it the revisionism and the orthodoxy of the Second International? Was it Lenin, or was it Marx himself in his late works, after he had abandoned his youthful humanism, as some humanist Marxists claimed decades ago? This entire trope has to be rejected. There is no opposition here. The fall is to be inscribed in the very origins. To put it even more pointedly, such a search for the intruder who infected the original model and set in motion its degeneration cannot but reproduce the logic of anti-Semitism. What this means is that even if, or rather especially if, one submits the Marxist path to ruthless critique, one has first to acknowledge it as one's own, taking full responsibility for it, not to comfortably reject the bad side of things by attributing it to a foreign element, the bad Engels who was too stupid to understand Marxist dialectics, the bad Lenin who did not grasp the core of Marxist theory, the bad Stalin who spoilt the noble plans of the good Lenin, and so on. The first thing we must do is to fully endorse the displacement in the history of Marxism concentrated in two great passages, or rather, violent cuts. The passage from Marx to Lenin, as well as the passage from Lenin to Mao. In each case, there is a displacement of the original constellation. From the most advanced country, as Marx expected, to a relatively backward country, the revolution took place in the wrong country. From workers to poor peasants as the main revolutionary agent. In the same way as Christ needed Paul's betrayal in order for Christianity to emerge as a universal church. Recall that, amongst the 12 apostles, Paul occupies the place of Judas the traitor, replacing him. Marx needed Lenin's betrayal in order to enact the first Marxist revolution. It is an inner necessity of the original teaching to submit to and survive this betrayal, to survive this violent act of being torn out of one's original context and thrown into a foreign landscape where it has to reinvent itself. Only in this way is universality born. So, apropos the second violent transposition, that of Mao, it is too easy either to condemn his reinvention of Marxism as theoretically inadequate, as a regression with regard to Marxist standards. It is easy to show that peasants lack substanceless proletarian subjectivity, but it is equally too facile to blur the violence of the cut and to accept Mao's reformulation as a logical continuation or application of Marxism, relying, as is usually the case, on the simple metaphoric expansion of class struggle. Today's predominant class struggle is no longer between capitalists and proletariat in each country. It has shifted to the third versus the first world, bourgeois versus proletarian nations. The achievement of Mao is here tremendous. His name stands for the political mobilization of the hundreds of millions of anonymous third world layers whose labor provided the invisible substance, the background of historical development. The mobilization of all those whom even such a poet of otherness as Levinas dismissed as the yellow peril, as we see in what is arguably his weirdest text, the Russo-Chinese debate and the dialectic, 1960, a comment on the Soviet-Chinese conflict. The yellow peril, it is not racial, it is spiritual. It does not involve inferior values, it involves a radical strangeness, a stranger to the weight of its past, from where there does not filter any familiar voice or inflection, a lunar or Martian past. Does this not recall Heidegger's insistence throughout the 1930s that the main task of Western thought today was to defend the Greek breakthrough, the founding gesture of the West, the overcoming of the pre-philosophical, mythical, Asiatic universe, to struggle against the renewed Asiatic threat? The greatest adversary of the West was the mythical in general, and the Asiatic in particular. It is this Asiatic radical strangeness which is mobilized, politicized, by Mao Zedong's communist movement. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel introduces his notorious notion of womankind as the everlasting irony of the community. Womankind changes by intrigue the universal end of the government into a private end, transforms its universal activity into a work of some particular individual, and perverts the universal property of the state into a possession and ornament for the family. In contrast to male ambition, a woman wants power in order to promote her own narrow family interests, or, even worse, her personal caprice, incapable as she is of perceiving the universal dimension of state politics. How are we not to recall F.W.J. Schelling's claim that the same principle carries and holds us in its ineffectiveness, which would consume and destroy us in its effectiveness? A power which, when it is kept in its proper place, can be benign and pacifying, turns into its radical opposite, into the most destructive fury, the moment it intervenes at a higher level, the level of which is not its own. The same femininity, which, within the closed circle of family life, is the power of protective love, turns into obscene frenzy when displayed at the level of public and state affairs. In short, it is acceptable for a woman to protest against public state power on behalf of the rights of the family and kinship, but woe to a society in which women endeavor directly to influence decisions concerning the affairs of state, manipulating their weak male partners, effectively emasculating them. Is there not something similar in the terror aroused by the prospect of the awakening of the anonymous Asian masses? They are fine if they protest at their fate and allow us to help them through large-scale humanitarian activity, but not when they empower themselves, to the horror of sympathetic liberals, always ready to support the revolt of the poor and dispossessed, so long as it is done with good manners. Georgi M. de Luguin's Borgias Secret Admirer in the Caucasus tells the extraordinary story of Musa Shanib from Abkhazia, the leading intellectual of this turbulent region, whose incredible career passed from Soviet dissident intellectual through democratic political reformer and Muslim fundamentalist war leader up to respected professor of philosophy, his entire career marked by a strange admiration for Pierre Bourdieu's thought. There are two ways to approach such a figure. The first reaction is to dismiss it as a local eccentricity, to treat it with benevolent irony. What a strange choice, Bourdieu. Who knows what this folkloric guy sees in Bourdieu? The second reaction is to directly assert the universal scope of theory. See how universal theory is. Every intellectual from Paris to Chechnya and Abkhazia can debate Bourdieu's concepts. The true task, of course, is to avoid both these options and to assert the universality of a theory as the result of hard theoretical work and struggle, a struggle that is not external to theory. The position is not only that Shanib had to do a lot of work to break the constraints of his local context and grasp Bourdieu. This appropriation of Bourdieu by an Abkhazian intellectual also affects the substance of the theory itself, transposing it into a different universe. Did, mutatis mutandis, Lenin not do something similar with Marx? The shift of Mao with regard to Lenin and Stalin concerns the relationship between the working class and the peasantry. Both Lenin and Stalin were deeply distrustful of the peasantry. They saw breaking the inertia of the peasantry as one of the main tasks of Soviet power, to uproot their substantial attachment to land, to proletarianize them, and thus fully expose them to the dynamics of modernization. In clear contrast to Mao, who, as we have noted, in his critical notes on Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR from 1958, remarked that Stalin's point of view is almost altogether wrong. The basic error is his mistrust of the peasants. The theoretical and political consequences of this shift are properly shattering. They imply no less than a thorough reworking of Marx's Hegelian notion of the position of the proletariat as that of substanceless subjectivity, of those who are reduced to the abyss of their subjectivity. As is well known by those who still remember their Marxism, the ambiguous central point of its theoretical structure concerns its premise that capitalism itself creates the conditions for its transcendence through proletarian revolution. How are we to read this? Is it to be read in a linear evolutionary way? Revolution should take place when capitalism fully develops all its potential and exhausts all its possibilities, the mythical point at which it confronts its central antagonism, contradiction, at its purest, in its naked form. And is it enough to add the subjective aspect, and to emphasize that the working class should not just sit and wait for the ripe moment, but educate itself through long struggle? As is also well known, Lenin's theory of the weakest link in the chain is a kind of compromise solution. Although it accepts that the first revolution can take place, not in the most developed country, but in a country in which the antagonisms of capitalist development are most aggravated, even if it is less developed, Russia, which combined concentrated modern capitalist industrial islands with agrarian backwardness and pre-democratic authoritarian government, it still perceived the October Revolution as a risky breakthrough, which could only succeed if it was soon accompanied by a large-scale Western European revolution. All eyes were focused on Germany in this respect. The radical abandonment of this model occurred only with Mao, for whom the proletarian revolution should take place in the less developed part of the world, among the wide masses of the Third World's impoverished peasants, workers, and even the patriotic bourgeoisie, who were exposed to the aftershocks of capitalist globalization, organizing their rage and despair. In a total reversal, perversion even, of Marx's model, the class struggle is thus reformulated as the struggle between First World bourgeois nations and Third World proletarian nations. The paradox here is properly dialectical, perhaps in the ultimate application of Mao's teaching on contradictions. Its very underdevelopment, and thus unripeness for the revolution, makes a country ripe for the revolution. Since, however, such unripe economic conditions do not allow the construction of properly post-capitalist socialism, the necessary correlate is the assertion of the primacy of politics over economics. The victorious revolutionary subject does not act as an instrument of economic necessity, liberating its potential, whose further development is thwarted by capitalist contradictions. It is, rather, a voluntarist agent which acts against spontaneous economic necessity, imposing its vision on reality through revolutionary terror. One should bear in mind here the fundamental lesson of Hegelian concrete universality. Universal necessity is not a teleological force which, operative from the outset, pulls the strings and runs the process, guaranteeing its happy outcome. On the contrary, this universal necessity is always retroactive. It emerges out of the radical contingency of the process and signals the moment of the contingency's self-Aufhebung. One should thus say that once the contingent passage from Leninism to Maoism took place, it cannot but appear as necessary. That is, one can reconstruct the inner necessity of Maoism as the next stage of the development of Marxism. In order to grasp this reversal of contingency into necessity, one should leave behind the standard linear historical time structured as the realization of possibilities. At the temporal moment X, there are multiple possible directions history can take, and what actually takes place is the realization of one of the possibilities. What this linear time is unable to grasp is the paradox of a contingent actual emergency, which retroactively creates its own possibility. Only when the thing takes place can we see how it was possible. The rather tiresome debate about the origins of Maoism, or Stalinism, oscillates around three main options. 1. The hard anti-communists and the hard partisans of Stalinism claim that there is a direct immanent logic which leads from Marx to Lenin and from Lenin to Stalin, and then from Stalin to Mao. 2. The soft critics claim that the Stalinist, or prior to it Leninist turn, is one of the historical possibilities present in Marx's theoretical structure. It could have turned out otherwise, but the Stalinist catastrophe is nonetheless inscribed as an option into the original theory itself. 3. Finally, the defenders of the purity of the original teaching of Marx dismiss Stalinism, or indeed Leninism, as a simple distortion, betrayal, insisting on the radical break between the two. Lenin and/or Stalin simply kidnapped Marxist theory and used it for purposes totally at odds with Marx. One should reject all three versions as based on the same underlying linear historicist notion of temporality, and opt for the fourth version, beyond the false question, to what extent was Marx responsible for the Stalinist catastrophe? Marx is entirely responsible, but retroactively. That is, the same holds for Stalin as for Kafka in Borges's famous formulation. They both created their own predecessors. This is the movement of concrete universality, this radical transubstantiation through which the original theory has to reinvent itself in a new context. Only by way of surviving this transplantation can it emerge as effectively universal. And, of course, the point is not that we are dealing here with the pseudo-Hegelian process of alienation and disalienation, of how the original theory is alienated and then has to incorporate the foreign context, reappropriate it, subordinate it to itself. What such a pseudo-Hegelian notion misses is the way this violent transplantation into a new context radically affects the original theory itself, so that when this theory returns to itself and its otherness, reinvents itself in the foreign context, its very substance changes. And yet this shift is not just the reaction to an external shock, it remains an inherent transformation of the same theory of the overcoming of capitalism. This is how capitalism is a concrete universality. It is not the question of isolating what all the particular forms of capitalism have in common, their shared universal features, but of grasping this matrix as a positive force in itself, as something which all actual particular forms try to counteract, the destructive effects of which they strive to contain.